Welcome. This session delves into how music, musicians, and disability intersect. It examines how disabled musicians navigate their careers and how their experiences challenge traditional notions of ability in the context of music. Special pedagogy in music, aimed at creating more inclusive teaching methods, also plays a significant role in this discussion. At the end of this session, you will be able to understand the impact of disability on musical careers, analyze theories of disability in music, explore self-representation in disabled musicians, examine disability in musical composition, understand the philosophy of independent living in the arts, and recognize the importance of inclusive education in music. Michael Bachan, an ethnomusicologist, contributes significantly to the discourse on autism and music. His work, Speaking for Ourselves, published in 2018, features interviews with 10 musicians on the autism spectrum, giving voices to their unique experiences in the world. Bachan's approach emphasizes the importance of self-representation and autonomy for disabled individuals in the arts, allowing them to speak about their own experiences rather than being spoken for. Neil Lerner and Joseph Strauss, in their volume Sounding Off, Theorizing Disability in Music, published in 2007, explore disability through a musical lens. The narrative of disability in music is complex, touching on the themes of pain, illness, and overcoming stereotypes. By examining various forms of disability in musical composition and performance, these scholars highlight the powerful role music can play in both reinforcing and subverting disability stereotypes. Music can serve as both an expressive and performative space for disability. For instance, the case of Glenn Gould, an autistic savant and renowned pianist, offers a lens into how autism can shape musical performance. Similarly, studies on stuttering in American popular song and other examples illustrate how disability has been musically represented and performed, often challenging preconceived notions of ability. The second part of the book touches on how disability is composed into music itself. By examining the works of composers like Hector Berlioz and Arnold Schoenberg and others, this part investigates how disability informs musical creation and interpretation. The Oxford Handbook of Music and Disability Studies was published in 2015. The essays in this volume share a theoretical and methodological connection to disability studies, especially its central idea that disability is a social and cultural construction. Disability is shown to be a core feature of the musical identity of music makers, especially composers and performers, something that affects their lives and works and their public reception. Music represents disability in various ways and affirms the notion that disability is a performance, something you do rather than something you are. These essays make the case that disability is not something at the periphery of culture and music, but something central to our art and to our humanity. The volume Extraordinary Measures, Disability in Music, published in 2011 by Joseph Strauss, studies the impact of disability and concepts of disability on composers, performers, and listeners with disabilities, as well as on the discourse about music and works of music themselves. critical response to music by composers with disability has struck changing conceptualization of disability as divine affliction, divine afflatus, medical pathology, and affirmative identity. The same is true for performers with disability. Disability, like music, is something they learn to perform, and they do so in accordance with well-established cultural scripts. Musical talent in Western culture is regarded as an extraordinary combination of technical proficiency and interpretative sensitivity. In Music, Disability and Society, Alex Lubet challenges the rigid view of technical skill and writes about music in relation to disability studies. He addresses the ways in which people with disabilities are denied the opportunity to participate in music. Elaborating on the theory of social confluence, Lubet provides a variety of encounters between disability and music to observe radical transformations of identity. He shows how the cultural world of classical music contrasts sharply with that of jazz, and how musicality itself is regarded as a disability in some religious contexts. Shaking All Over, Popular Music and Disability explores the relationship between popular music and disability, examining how disabled musicians have influenced and shaped musical genres and cultures. McKay highlights how disability is often stigmatized and overlooked in the music industry, yet some of the most iconic figures in popular music, such as Neil Young and Syd Barrett, have used their disabilities to challenge norms and create new forms of expression. Now our discussion will shift toward the idea of full inclusion in music and education, aligning with broader disability studies. Full inclusion advocates for all students, regardless of ability, being integrated into mainstream educational environments. In the context of music, this implies creating inclusive spaces where disabled musicians can thrive alongside their non-disabled peers. One example of this kind of studies is represented by Italian Journal of Disability Studies that covers a broad range of disability-related topics, from the history of special education in Italy to theoretical frameworks like the English and American social models. It examines themes such as independent living, the intersection of disability with social sciences and anthropology, and crypt theory. The journal also delves into critical disability studies, deaf studies, critical autism studies, and the concept of full inclusion, emphasizing the importance of adopting inclusive practices informed by these interdisciplinary perspectives. In the volume Sante de Sanctis by Morgese and Lombardo, Italy's approach to special education is explored, from the historical treatment of conditions like cretinism and idiocy to modern practices of integration and inclusion. Italy has been a leader in deinstitutionalization, moving toward inclusive education systems that integrate children with disabilities into mainstream schools, a philosophy that aligns closely with the ideals of the UNESCO Salamanca Statement, 1994. In this number of the journal Studi Culturali, the Scandinavia Disability Project of Independent Living is explored. Despite some differences in terminology, there is general agreement among disabled activists and their supporters on the four principles that characterize the philosophy of independent living. These include that all human lives, regardless of the nature, complexity, or severity of disability, is of equal value, Everyone, regardless of nature, complexity, or severity of disability, has the capacity to make choices and must be enabled to make them. People disabled by the social response to any form of impairment have the right to exercise control over their lives. People with impairments perceived and labeled as disabled have the right to participate in all areas. The Salamanca Declaration reaffirmed the universal right to education as stated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948 and renewed the international commitment made at the 1990 World Conference on Education for All. It recalls the 1993 United Nations rules for the equalization of opportunities for people with disabilities, which call for the inclusion of people with disabilities in education systems. So, key principles of full inclusion are the following. Education is a fundamental right of every child who must have the opportunity to acquire and maintain an acceptable level of knowledge. Every child has characteristics, interests, predispositions, and learning needs that are unique to them. Education system must be designed and programs implemented in a way that takes into account this great diversity and characteristics and needs. People with special educational needs must have access to mainstream schools that must integrate them into a child-centered pedagogical system capable of meeting these needs. Normal schools that take this integration orientation are the most effective way to combat discriminatory behavior, creating welcoming communities, building an inclusive society, and achieving the goal of education for all. So this is why the Declaration of Salamanca in 1994 invited and urged all governments to prioritize in policies and budgets the improvement of education systems in order to accommodate all children, regardless of individual differences and difficulties. Adopt as law or policy the principle of inclusive education, accepting all children in mainstream schools, unless force major reasons are opposed, and develop pilot projects and foster exchanges with countries where integration schools already exist. The Index for Inclusion by Booth and ISCO, published in 2002, outlines inclusion as a process, taking over the principles of the Salamanca Statement, and progressing from insertion to integration to full inclusion. It serves as a tool for schools to assess and improve their inclusivity through continuous recursive evaluation, promoting ongoing reflection and improvement in creative, inclusive environments. So actually it's a book, but it is also a tool. So it includes 3 parts. The first one is devoted to an inclusive approach to school development. The second, to the development process with the index. The third, to indicators for inclusion and questions. And the fourth, to summary sheets and questionnaires. The 3 dimensions that the index takes into account are policies, practices, and cultures. So producing inclusive policies, evolving inclusive practices, and creative inclusive cultures. For each dimension, there are different indicators. For example, creating inclusive culture establishing inclusive values has the following indicators. Expectations are high for all the students. Teaching team managers, students, and parents, educators share an inclusive philosophy. Students are assessed equally, etc. And so the index is a tool because it includes dimensions, indicators, and questions. For examples, dimension A, creating inclusive cultures, includes different indicators, among them establishing inclusive values, which implies that expectations are high for all students. To test this indicator, some possible questions suggested by the index are the following. Does every student feel that they attend a school where they can achieve the highest results? Are all students encouraged to hold high aspirations for learning goals? Are all students treated as if there were no limits to their learning? And so on. So these questions can be adopted by a school or an educational environment to self-assess the inclusivity of their school or this environment. Last but not least, I want to present a book by Nicole Eredix, Inclusion into Actions, that emphasize curriculum modifications to break barrier to full inclusion. Her guidebook provides strategies for creative and inclusive classroom culture, covering collaboration, universal design for learning, co-teaching, social-emotional supports, and accommodations. The book offers 40 practical, teacher-tested strategies to modify curricula, complete with step-by-step directions, goals, tips, and student work examples. Thank you for your attention.